Okay. Well, let's kind of start off kind of quick. So I will be arguing for the pro, which is there are objective moral values. Forgive my shaky camera time, sitting in a small rooms. I have the more trickier case to make, since I think intuitively, in a social-cultural sense, people are pretty confident that morality is a subjective manner. And I think through Glaze, you can see this through history. So I'll attempt to make kind of an opening statement about the nature of morality. I try to generally stay away from moral debates. One, because of the issue with trying to be objective about moral statements, about moral feelings. It's impossible. There's always a personal and emotional commitment to moral ideas, and so they can quickly turn sour. So I'll try to remain as objective as possible. And so I'll just, my small case is going to try to demonstrate that morality is objective in the sense that people know it to be objective naturally, that we historically and intuitively know objective moral feelings, and that the moral impulse that we all share is pretty universal and consistent. And I won't make my case for my opponent, but I'm sure he'll show the opposite. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to him and let him make a small.
Thanks. I just want to say that I'm very grateful to QallOut and my opponent for having this debate. I am arguing on the negative, that I do not believe that objective morality exists. And simply put, what I believe is that as an atheist, I don't believe there is a God. And the only people that I've found, for the most part, besides philosophers who just enjoy discussing the subject, are people who are religious and believe that we have objective morality because there is a being that holds some kind of objective guide for morals. And so without that objective guide for morals, we don't know what's right and wrong. I believe that, as you said, that we intrinsically know what is right and wrong, but you said that we know that we have objective morals. I don't believe that we know that we have objective morals. I believe that we know intrinsically that we have morals, and I believe that our morality comes partially from our evolution because it allowed us to work with one another. And there's other things like our immune system that protected us. Our morals would have helped us get along with other tribes or each other so that we weren't constantly fighting and hurting each other all the time. So Sam Harris has argued a lot that morality is in the brain, and since consciousness, as far as we know, is in the brain, and everything we know that we perceive is in the brain, decisions around the discussion of morality is also inside the brain, and therefore is the domain of science and not philosophy, although philosophy is important for morality. So that's my opening. I'll go
ahead. In that, I could say that in that sense, I could still grant all of those premises and still conclude that there are objective moral values, in the idea that even if evolutionary ethics were the case and morality has evolved over time through impasse, through social pressure, through the need for survival, I could still say that there are objective moral feelings that are still universal within the human species. And I'd say that it is our cultures that really produce these kinds of evidences. And I've got a series of evidences that I've kind of written out, and sometimes I've got really foggy ways to put things, so I usually have to write things down. So in this, I would say that the case for moral objective values, saying that there even is no God, there are a lot of philosophers, I would say, I think it's currently 2/3 of moral philosophers who adhere to moral realism, that moral objective values do exist, whether they're Christian, agnostic, atheist. Even Sam Harris himself has argued for objective moral values. He simply doesn't ground them in God. He grounds them in specific principles in human behavior or mental powers, the mentality of humankind. But I would say that even if that were the case, I still believe that moral objective values exist for these reasons. It is nearly universal across human cultures. There exists the same basic standards of morality. In addition, there exists in all cultures truly altruistic acts which lead to no genetic benefit. I say that people normally, under almost all circumstances, behave in a particular fashion. They do aim to be altruistic. We, in our cultures, try to uphold the ideas that altruism is a good thing, that preserving the life of other people and not stealing and not killing and not raping are good ideologies, whether they have to adhere to them or not. In that, I would say that we behave objectively. And of course, that doesn't prove that objective morality exists, but that we have a consistent type of behavior that does seem to appeal towards being good in some mannerism. I would say that throughout history, the moral concepts have not really changed, just who they apply to. Hammurabi's code generally seems to apply to even our Constitution today in the idea of free leadership and respecting other people and being kind and compassionate. But the people that was aimed to was only a specific group. Now, while those principles were still universally the same as they are today, it's who they applied to is what changed. And throughout history, it seems to have changed to different groups over time. The majority of people who explicitly deny the existence of objective morality still act as if objective morality exists. And I'll go ahead and move into the second premise, the third, because I think this is kind of the same. There exists a nearly universal human intuition that certain things are objectively right and wrong. Even if we can't epistemologically know what is good and what is evil, how we get to morality, ontologically, I still believe that the nature of morality is still fairly universal in our application. We still, regardless of the anti-behaviors, where there are some people like sociopaths who don't seem to have moral regulations or moral impulses, I think those are exceptions and not standards. And then the standard would be that that people behave objectively, even if under any circumstance they would say otherwise. I'm sure my opponent, though, would argue that morality is relative, still lives a morally good life and still behaves in consistency with other people. I'm sure he upholds that murder is wrong and that killing children is terrible and that mass suicide or the burning of millions of Jews in ovens is a terrible atrocity, and yet could still claim that morality is subjective. So his behavior and my behavior, I would think, lends to the idea that moral objective values exist versus the contrary. There seems to be a cultural consistency throughout time where people behaved in a particular fashion that was consistent, even if, regardless of who the subject was, slavery is okay so long as you're, a white man owning a black man, or if you want to be black and owning the Irish, or the Barbary who owned the Europeans, those kinds of things. That's okay because they're not us, but us too, and within us, we believe that morality says that slavery is wrong. You can't enslave your children. You can't enslave your father. You can't enslave your neighbor. So the moral principle still exists, like I said, but it applies to different people and based on tribalism. If you're not me, you're against me. The morality of major philosophers tends to be that moral objective facts exist. That's kind of difficult to prove, but it's what I know of. We all judge others, which entails applying a standard of behavior which we think actually applies to other people and not just ourselves. We do have a tendency to judge the moral behaviors of other people. A lot of theists, anti-theists, Islam, judge the morality of other people's religion or non-religion based on what they feel is a moral framework. You say that God is immoral because he's come in the Old Testament in Genesis and wiped out the human race, and we say, well, that's immoral, based on our natural intuition that there is an objective standard in which to judge whether something is morally right or morally wrong. I think we have a natural propensity to act as if there is an objective moral standard, even if we don't always do so. When accused of wrongdoing, our first instinct is to deny the standard. It's not to deny the standard, but to make excuses for why we didn't violate the standard. In criminal law, there seems to be a natural intuition to say, when I was younger, I remember being like 6 or 7, I went to a store and I stole a candy bar because I wanted it. I felt really, really guilty Now, no one really in my life, considering my life, had ever taught me that stealing was wrong. My parents never discussed it with me. I never went over it in school. But I immediately felt moral guilt for doing so, whether that be driven by my genes or whether that be something that I understand intrinsically or transcendently. I still behave as if I believe in moral objective standards. I don't dismiss and say that, well, there's no objective standard and I have no moral impulse or moral feelings to behave or to adhere to. I always seem to act as if inside of me there is a moral compass that tries to point me to right and wrong, even if I don't always understand what they are. Moral decision making is difficult because we think there are actually correctness and incorrect answers to moral questions. The abortion topic or the topic of homosexuality or homosexual marriage. People are pretty adamant that there is an objective yes and an objective no to the answer. And of course, they disagree on the nature of that, but they always tend to agree that there is a moral law of thought and the idea of the law of identity, that A is A, that there is an objective moral question and that there is also an objective moral answer. I think people tend to behave that way. And then moral relativists are, I would say, inconsistent, and that's because of the nature of moral inconsistency, the subjective nature of what one person finds to be moral is another person finds to be immoral. But within relativists themselves, I think they also themselves act pretty objective in that they all seem to align with a particular moral thought. And of course, the last point that I'll make is that we all find moral relativism to be counterintuitive when we think about specific instances of moral wrongdoing. I can't say I've ever met a person, which I always try to, for moral relativists that I meet, I try to ask very specific questions that I think everyone always agrees on. Is it morally wrong to rape and sacrifice children? I have never gotten a yes out of that question. Never. And of course, that's within the context of the United States and a morally Christian historical background. But of course, I've been to Somalia and I've been to Iraq and I've been to Japan and I've asked a lot of people that question and I've never had an affirmative yes or even a hesitation. I think that there are moral objective values in that we do all seem to flock to the same moral principles, even if we can't always know them clearly. It's not really the epistemological problem, but that is there a moral truth? Is there a moral principle which we all follow? I believe, yes, naturally it is. And then I'll go ahead and turn it over to my opponent. He seems pretty excited to answer.
Thank you. Shut up, dog. Okay. I'm sorry. I was trying to get your attention because I didn't want you to use up all your time. I wanted to be able to address the points point by point, but I tried to keep notes. So I'm going to try to go in reverse of what you were just saying. So you just said, when I've talked to people about child sacrifice, I've never had somebody go, that's something that I can be okay with. Ironically, it is totally okay with God of the Old Testament. And Abraham was actually encouraged to sacrifice his son as a show of good spirit and a show of faith to God. And the only reason that he was stopped as he was bringing the weapon, or I forget exactly what he was bringing down on his son Isaac, was an angel stopping him and a sacrifice being brought in. But it was seen as a good thing. It was seen as this man was willing to sacrifice his son, his only son, and that is a show of love. And as I said in the beginning of my introduction, people who discuss moral objectivity are usually people who are doing so with a God in mind. They're usually doing it with Scripture in mind. And so if you're going to say that there is objective morals, you have to decide what you're basing those objective morals on. I know very little about you, but from the conversation we've had off of here, you told me that you're a Christian. So I'm guessing that the Judeo-Christian morals would be what you would prescribe to. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and so on and so forth. I think that it's very scary that those morals are missing so much. It doesn't say not to hit your children. It doesn't say not to sacrifice your children. It actually encourages parents as a show of faith to God to do so. So I think that you actually set me up for a perfect example of somebody who was able to say that sacrifice was a good thing. And that brings me to my next point. I'm going to digress away from the responses just because I want to say this quote. I don't remember the author, and I was going to look it up, but I totally spaced. One of my favorite quotes is, "With or without religion, you would have good people doing good things and bad people doing bad things. But for a good person to do a bad thing, that takes religion." And a good example of that I've provided with other people is circumcision. That no parent would see their child born and look at them and say, "Oh, they're so beautiful, my son, he's just perfect, but we need to get a knife and cut up his foreskin a little bit, and then he'll be just right." The only people who do that are people who have been told that circumcision is a good thing, and it's usually for religious reasons. Now, I'm not going to get into the pseudoscience reasons that other people say, but that's the reason it started, and that's the reason it's so prominent. Some of the other points you said were moral relativism is counterintuitive. And I think that that kind of proves my point in a way, because if objective morals are objective, by definition, they would have to apply to everyone and everything. So essentially, if lying was bad, then there would be no example of where somebody could lie and it wouldn't be bad. So let's say that, you know, you had a gun put to your head and your wife was hiding in the closet and somebody was breaking into your house and they said, "Is your wife in the closet?" And you said no. That, I could say, would be a moral lie, that would be an okay thing to lie about morally. But if objectively lying is bad, then it doesn't matter that somebody has a gun to your head and that your wife is in the closet, because objectively lying is wrong no matter what. So you can't start making exceptions. So I was reading something about ethical morality and the fact that our morals come from conclusions and not prescriptions. So when, like the example I just provided, that is based, the reason that I think it is morally okay is because I've come to the conclusion that it's morally okay. Whereas if you prescribe that lying is bad all around and it's objectively bad, there are no room for exceptions. There is no room for any kind of deviation from that. And my little bit of time left, I can't address all the points you made, but I feel like I've addressed a few. I just want to say 9 quick facts. They're from Sam Harris. Getting from is to ought. Fact number 1, there are behaviors, intentions, cultural practices, etc., which potentially lead to the worst possible misery for everyone. There are also behaviors, intentions, cultural practices which do not, and which in fact lead to states of well-being for many sentient creatures, to the degree that well-being is possible in this universe. While it may be, and this is fact number 2, sorry, while it may be difficult in practice, distinguishing between these two sets is possible in principle. And I'll pause right there and say that a good example of this would be, I would never argue that there must be one right food to eat. There are clearly a range of things that we can eat, but there's a very distinct thing between food we can eat and poison. So while I would never feel like I could say that there is one right thing to eat, because there's so many, I can say that there are right things to eat and there are wrong things to eat. So it's a vast spectrum. Fact number 3, our values are ways of thinking about this domain of possibilities. If we value liberty, privacy, benevolence, dignity, freedom of expression, honesty, good manners, the rights to own property, etc., we value these things only insofar as we judge them to be part of the second set of factors conducive to someone's well-being. Fact number 4, values therefore are explicit or implicit. Judgments about how the universe works are themselves facts about our universe, i.e. the states of the human brain. Religious values focusing on God's will or the law of karma are no exception. The reason to respect God's will or the law of karma is to avoid the worst possible misery for many, most, or even all sentient beings. So you're not good by doing something because you're afraid of the punishment. That's not a moral action. It is possible to be confused or mistaken about how the universe works. It is therefore possible to have the wrong values, i.e. values which lead toward rather than away from the worst possible misery for everyone. Given that the well-being of humans and animals must depend on the state, I just lost where I was. Given the value that well-being of humans and animals must depend on the states of the world and on the states of their brains, and science represents our most systematic means of understanding these states. Science can potentially help us avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. Fact number 7, insofar as our subsidiaries values can be in conflict, e.g. individual rights versus collective security, the rights to privacy versus freedom of expression, it may be possible to decide which priorities will most fully avoid the worst possible misery for many, most, or even all sentient beings. Science, therefore, can in principle, if not always in practice, determine and prioritize our subsidiary values. Example, should we honor, and if so, when and how much? Fact number 8, one cannot reasonably ask, but why is the worst possible misery for everyone bad? For if the worst possible misery for everyone is not bad, then the word bad has no meaning. This would be like asking, but why is a perfect circle round? The question can be posed, but it expresses only confusion, not an intelligible basis for skeptical doubt. Likewise, one cannot ask, but why ought we avoid the worst possible misery for everyone? For the term ought has any application at all. It is urging us away from the worst possible misery for everyone. And fact number 9, one can therefore derive ought from is. For if there is a behavior, intention, cultural practice, etc., that seems likely to produce the worst possible misery for everyone, one ought not adopt it. All lesser ethical concerns and obligations follow from this. So basically, long or the short is that objective morals in a scientific sense might be possible in a way that we can come to understand, but even then they wouldn't be objective because they would be applying to our species. So that's another thing that you talked about, is how we know these objective morals for our species and how they're kind of intrinsic for us. It's weird how all of these things affect us. Like these things about theft and perjury, those are not things that we often find in nature, but in nature we do find a lot of empathy. We do find a lot of animals who practice things that we would consider to be morally wrong or morally right. So I'll pass the mic back to you so that you can address some of these points, and we both.
Okay, Harris, of course, stands very firmly on utilitarian ethics. And I would suppose that as far as when I was an atheist for predominance of my life, I was very utilitarian. The issue with utilitarian ethics, that you do the most amount of good for the most amount of people, doesn't always distinguish the difference between what is morally good and what is morally false or bad, in the idea that if what is good for 90% of the people in the population is to enslave the other 10%, then in a utilitarian sense, this would be a morally acceptable action. Though those that are slaves would definitely feel the opposite. And it would be in this idea of cultural relativism, that if every society founds its own moral ethics in the subjective sense, then there's a lot of, I believe, fundamental flaws that come along with this. If every culture, through moral consensus, that what is good for the most amount of people, or for what the society deems is good or is false, is counterintuitive to our intuitions, because if that were the case, if moral consensus were true, then any nation that adhered to one moral principle and rejected others would be doing something that is morally good, and a nation that tried to go through moral reform or going against the grain of the reformation of moral ethics would be bad. So Adolf Hitler, who united the nation in one singular moral belief, that was already pretty commonplace at the time, would have been morally good. And then someone like Martin Luther King, who was trying to reform moral ethics of the United States so that being racist or hating blacks was morally wrong, was trying to change the consensus of that time. So if moral relativism is true and morality is truly subjective, the moral rightness would be what is objectively true to the consensus, and what is moral wrong would be a tearing down of that consensus. But of course, if consensus is the standard in which we use to argue moral feelings, moral goodness, to say that morality is subjective based on everyone's interpretation of it, to argue that morality is relative is to argue that there is an objective nature to moral ontology. doing so, universal consensus cannot make a subjective statement objective, and disagreement cannot make an objective statement subjective. Consensus, or the lack of consensus, has absolutely nothing to do with whether a claim is objective or subjective. If I were to speed down the road in my car and got pulled over, I would get a ticket for speeding. Now, if I were to break that rule, would that go to say, because I've broken that rule, that speed limits don't exist? So it would be to say that if all cultures seem to adhere to murder is wrong, and there is another one that doesn't, does this truly create a foundation for us to say that morality is subjective? Well, no, even if someone behaves contrary to moral behavior, that doesn't mean that morality is itself subjective. It would be to say that they've gone against the grain, that they have ignored their moral impulse, that they've gone against what would be objectively true. I think the laws of logic don't permit subjective moral values, and because of the idea of the law of identity, A is A, and of course the law of contradiction, it is to say that murder is wrong is one propositional moral statement, and murder is good is another propositional statement. The law of contradiction would say that only one of them can be true because they cannot both simultaneously be true, or else you create a contradiction. They cannot both be morally good and morally bad at the same time. So it would be that to make a moral statement at all would be to say that one had to be objectively true. It is wrong to murder people. Now, moral specificity, as my opponent has said, that there are situations in which it's wrong to lie, and there are situations that are okay to lie, like to save a spouse. At least from a theistic thinking, there is a moral stepladder. It's not to say that the principles aren't morally binding because they don't fit into every scenario. It would be that they are morally binding in principle, that there are moral behaviors that are more moral than other ones. They have a moral precedence. And that would be to preserve life. The key is to preserve life. And in every situation, you have to try to preserve life. And that is a morally good thing. Well, what happens if the mother is dying and you have to abort the child? Well, you create a moral dilemma. But in principle, trying to preserve the life of everyone is the moral principle. But of course, we live in a decaying and decrepit world, and so you have to make moral shortcuts or things that aren't as in moral nature lower on the stepladder. We have prime virtues that we have above all. Respecting human life, not doing anything that would disrupt the nature of things, like stealing people's food or killing people's children. There are situations, I believe, that do arise where there is no moral out, but I don't think that has to do with the idea that morals aren't objective. I think it has to do that we are corrupt beings, and in that, we do things that are against the moral grain. We end up in scenarios where there is no moral right in that scenario. There is the moral best you can do. So I'll try to turn it over here really quickly so I don't run out of time. So the largest problem with moral subjective is publication. That if morality is truly subjective, then there is no ultimate or transcendent objectivity in order to make people up to their moral behavior. You can say that you don't like it. You can say that you don't agree with it, or that you're impartial to it, or that you don't prefer that. But you can never say, like David Hume, the is ought, that you cannot say is or ought because there is no for it to be. There would have to be a design in order to say that something ought to be or is to be. There would have to be orchestrated in some mannerism. I believe that our behavior seems to be more in tune, that we all adhere to a type of moral structure, that we do have an is and an ought, even if we don't understand its origin, whether it be evolutionary or theological. I would say that we still, in our natural behavior, behave as if moral values exist. And so I think that leans more towards the objective moral framework existing than its contrary, that subjective morality exists.
Yeah, I never know where to start with these. You make a lot of points, and most of them are very good points. So most of that, I feel like I need to go back and rebut them. I wish I could address them all. I wish we could do this more point by point. Next time we'll have to do that. I wasn't, you were saying that you were talking about a moral consensus, and that's not what I was arguing. I wasn't arguing that morals would be decided by a consensus. I was saying that the best possible happiness for everyone is the route that we would go. And in that world, that slavery doesn't exist, because slavery is not in the best possible happiness for everyone. So that wouldn't even exist in the world that I'm thinking of hypothetically. Sam Harris again has a really, really good point about the kind of the worst possible misery for everybody, where he talks about that explicitly. And I'm trying to find it, but I'm not able. Oh, here it is. Well, never mind. I'll just go ahead and try to address some of the points that you're making. But about the consensus, I really don't think that it would come down to having to use other people, because if we cannot determine that using people for our own benefit to their detriment is not bad, then the discussion, because you said this was kind of intrinsic, it's something that we feel like when you steal something and you're a child and you don't know necessarily that theft is super wrong, but you still feel like you did something wrong. It's something that's innate in us. And morality existed before religion. I thought during this debate you were going to use religion and God to try and ground your moral framework. I still haven't heard you ground your moral framework. So if I could, so I could actually go into this a little further, I'd just like to give you a few seconds. I don't want you to use too much time because you don't have much left. But if you could tell me if your moral framework, if your objective morals are based in a deity, and that's how, because that's the only thing I've heard, because there's no other like scientific objective morals right now. So the only thing that I've heard argued is from a deity. So is that the argument?
No, not entirely. I would say that my argument is that my experiential, the experience of human behavior always manages to seem to be objective. Now, being a Christian, naturally, I flock to the idea that as a creator of all things, that God would be the moral foundation. I would say that objective moral values exist, and how I justify the framework of moral objective values is through the Christian God, that God is the founder of.
Okay, so that goes back to my original point about you said who would say that child sacrifice is something that, well, I mean, God sacrificed his only son. God sacrificed his only child. And that was supposed to be, and that's the thing, is Christianity is a cult of human sacrifice. And the difference between a cult and a religion is a religion is a large cult and a cult is a small religion. But I won't get into that. We're not talking about religion. I just wanted to say that if we're going to use Christianity, I think that it's difficult to be able to say that you're talking about morals when you're using something that is so immoral. I pulled up a bunch of Bible verses, and I'm not going to go into them, but I think people could just find on their own that there are a lot of things, from rape to slavery to genocide to incest. I mean, there is a lot of stuff in the Bible that would be considered immoral by our standards today. And yet people use the Judeo-Christian God and the Judeo-Christian scripture to justify morality objectively. And I guess it's just confusing to me, because you don't seem like somebody who would think any of those things are okay. And so I would like you to address this point if you feel like you have time, but I'd like to know why you feel like that is something that you would be willing to ground. I guess if you're accepting it or you're believing in it. I don't know for you which one it is, because I know for some people it's kind of like they just accept that it's there, and then other people believe that it's there and they kind of deal with it from there. Objective morals, I believe, cannot exist because of the fact that as a species, we think of everything to do with us. We are in a small speck of dust in the Milky Way, and the universe is so vast that objective morals to an entirely different kind of species would not even necessarily pertain to us. If you think about the morals that a bee colony would have, the morality that a bee colony would have would be so much different than the morality we would have. But yet, if there are objective morals, then we would find the same things throughout humanity. Also, if objective morals were grounded in Judeo-Christian religion, it would make more sense that back when God was very, very active, that people were more moral. And yet when we look back in history, people would literally bury children in post holes because they believed that if they buried children in post holes, it would keep their house from being haunted. So thinking that we can get our morality from something that's 2,000 years old, which I don't think that you're necessarily arguing. So I'm not trying to strawman you. I just believe that if you're going to say that you feel like you can ground them in a Judeo-Christian belief system, I think that that needs to be squared with the fact that it's just an extremely immoral book that justifies so many horrible things. I think it's dangerous to have objective morals in the sense that it's, as I said, that morals should be a conclusion and not a prescription. The example I gave about somebody breaking into your house and holding a gun to your head and lying bad. If lying is objectively bad, then telling the robber that your wife is not where she is something that is objectively wrong. And I don't believe that. I believe that we come to our conclusions about moral things. For instance, if somebody had, like you said, you stole a pack of gum or whatever it was from that store. If a woman stole a loaf of bread so she could feed her children who were starving, I think that that is morally okay. I don't think that a theft, which I believe is immoral, is as immoral as it would be if it was done for selfish reasons. So again, I think that we try to make objective morality objective because it makes us feel better, thinking that we're striving for a certain goal. But in reality, things change as we go, as we understand things. And if you go over to Saudi Arabia, what is seen as moral by a man hitting a woman because she decides not to wear a veil is considered morally acceptable. There are very few people that you'll meet, both male and female, who have not been educated outside of their moral spectrum, who will think that it's okay or that they deserve it. So I think it's a very sticky situation. I feel like I'm using my time up. We're getting close to being at the same point. So I'd like to ask a question before I move forward, and that is just if you believe in objective morals, let's say that happiness is something that you can give somebody in units. Would it be better to give one person 100 units of happiness or 50 people 1 unit of happiness apiece?
I actually can't address that question, though I'd like to. I want to make one major point. I've only got 60 seconds. To say that any specific moral act within the Bible, whether it adheres to slavery or the killing of children, which I would argue, of course, none of those things are true, and that I could demonstrate that those things are just simple contextual misunderstandings. But to say that God is a moral monster, that God behaves malevolently and does evil things, requires that we as the people, that David would have a moral objective standard in which to judge the behavior of God in order to distinguish the difference between something that is morally good and something that is morally wrong. If nature of morality is subjective, then we really can't say that what happens in the Bible is actually morally wrong. It's just preferential. It's something that I prefer. I don't like the idea of killing children, but ultimately, transcendently, beyond space and time and objective to the culture, we can't really say that that's the case. We can only not like it. So to say that the Bible is immoral would be to adopt the idea that there's an objective standard.
Okay, well, thank you so much again for watching. The last point I want to make is just that I think that this would be a great debate to have, and I'd like to discuss, religion further. I think that if you're going to use scripture or the God of scripture to justify objective morality, then you have to be able to address certain things that are in scripture, like justifying rape or saying, if you beat your slave, you have to, if they die, you should be punished. But if they're not dead and they're just severely injured, then, you get off. I think that you have to be able to address those things and not just dismiss them. But that's a conversation for a different time. Objective morals would be a dangerous thing to have because they would be objective. They would never change. And I